The grand ballroom of Whitby Manor glimmered under the brilliance of countless crystal chandeliers, their trembling lights scattering across polished oak floors as though attempting to conceal the growing shadows of whispered judgment. Lady Eleanor Whitby, the youngest and most spirited of her family, stood near the periphery, her chest tightening with every polite murmur that brushed past her like a cold wind. The scent of roses and candle wax clung to the air, mingling with the faint tang of polished leather and dust from the recent carriage arrivals. She had worn her pale blue gown with care, the silk meticulously pleated to flatter her slender frame, yet no refinement could shield her from the sharp scrutiny of London's most scrutinizing eyes. Even now, she felt their weight, invisible chains tightening around her as the chatter rose and fell like a tide. Her mother, a stern woman of relentless propriety, hovered nearby, her gloved hands folded over the bodice of her gown, eyes scanning the room with vigilant pride. "Eleanor," she said softly, yet the tone carried the precision of a blade, "you must maintain your composure. Remember your duty tonight." Duty, Eleanor thought bitterly, was an unyielding mistress. She was not a child to be coddled, nor a pawn to be positioned at another's bidding, yet here she stood, poised to be paraded before suitors who viewed her less as a person than as the sum of her inheritance. The manor's walls, adorned with ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her every gesture, felt less like protection than accusation. A laugh, polite, yet edged with barely concealed mockery, drifted from a nearby cluster of guests, and Eleanor's cheeks warmed with humiliation. Her father, who had often championed her fiery spirit in private, now offered only a nod of polite encouragement, caught between the demands of society and the practicalities of preserving the family estate. He had arranged the match herself, a marriage that would rescue their fortunes from a slow and steady decline. The man she was expected to wed was neither cruel nor unkind, yet the thought of binding her life to obligation alone, without love, ignited a quiet revolt in her soul. She shifted her weight, the hem of her gown brushing against the parquet, her pulse quickening as her mother's eyes momentarily narrowed in warning. A delicate harp began to play, soft notes curling through the room, coaxing couples into the first dance of the evening. Eleanor's attention wavered between the polished shoes sliding across the floor and the murmured conversations around her. Names were exchanged like currency, compliments weighed with hidden barbs, and she felt herself shrinking beneath the invisible ledger of society's expectations. Every glance she received seemed to measure her worth, her comportment, her grace, her silence. And in that silence, Eleanor's mind raced, calculating escape, seeking the narrowest path between duty and freedom. Her heart ached with a longing she dared not name, a hope she barely permitted herself to imagine. It was then, as if summoned by her unrest, that she caught sight of him, a man whose presence seemed to command the very air of the room without ostentation. Alexander Hawthorne, newly titled Duke of Westmere, stood across the hall, observing the gathering with a quiet authority. He was a figure of measured power, his dark coat tailored impeccably, the subtle glint of a signet ring catching the chandelier's light as his hand rested lightly upon it. Guests deferred to him with a mixture of respect and hesitation, aware that his influence in Parliament and Council to the Prince Regent rendered him more than a mere social figure. Yet in Eleanor's eyes, he was less a man of politics than a shadow against which she might measure her own small rebellions. She felt, in some unspoken way, that he too understood the weight of expectation. Her gaze was abruptly drawn away by the approach of her intended fiancé, a man whose polite smile belied the calculated ambition beneath. He greeted her with the courtesy expected of the ton, bowing slightly, yet Eleanor perceived the underlying message. Compliance would ensure favor, resistance would invite ridicule. "Lady Eleanor," he said, voice smooth, measured, but with an edge that made her skin prickle, "I trust the evening finds you well." She forced a nod, allowing only the faintest lift of her chin, careful not to betray the storm of defiance gathering within her. Each word between them was a duel of restraint and subtle power, a silent contest that left Eleanor trembling with the desire to escape. The orchestra swelled and dancers twirled past, their skirts and coats sweeping across the polished floor like waves. Eleanor's thoughts raced. She imagined fleeing the manor, slipping past the maids and guards, through the shadowed corridors and into the crisp night air. Somewhere beyond the glittering facade of the ballroom lay freedom, a chance to reclaim her life, to breathe without the constant scrutiny of judgmental eyes. Her pulse throbbed in time with the music, a secret drumbeat urging her toward courage. The whispers, once suffocating, now seemed distant, a reminder of the society she sought to defy. She knew she could not remain, could not endure another evening of hollow pleasantries and veiled threats. Her resolve crystallized as she stepped lightly toward a side door, her fingers grazing the cool brass handle. Behind her, the muffled conversations continued, oblivious to her intent. A final glance toward the ballroom revealed her mother's sharp eyes, a fleeting warning that made Eleanor's heart lurch. She forced herself to smile faintly, a mask of politeness that concealed the storm within, and slipped into the shadowed corridor beyond. The air outside was damp, tinged with the scent of winter frost and distant smoke from the chimneys. The moon, partially veiled by clouds, cast silver streaks across the cobblestones, guiding her steps as though conspiring with her desire for freedom. She paused, listening for the inevitable calls of the servants or the echo of her mother's voice, but all that reached her ears was the rustle of her gown and the distant toll of a clock marking the hour. Eleanor's chest rose and fell with anticipation and fear alike. She was alone, yet not entirely. Her spirit bristled with the exhilaration of defiance. Somewhere beyond the manor's gates, a carriage waited, unassuming yet promising escape. Her mind briefly flickered to the consequences of her flight: scandal, familial wrath, society's condemnation. But she quelled the thoughts as one might extinguish a candle, resolute to pursue this fleeting chance at agency. Tonight she would reclaim herself. With a final, determined breath, she pressed forward, each step echoing in the empty corridor like a heartbeat of rebellion. She felt the cool night air on her face, the first hint of liberation brushing against her cheeks. Behind her, the ballroom continued its opulent performance, unaware that one young woman had chosen defiance over duty. Eleanor Whitby, heiress of a fading fortune, now carried a secret as dangerous as it was precious: the knowledge that her life might yet belong to herself. And with that thought, the shadows of the manor receded, and the night ahead promised both peril and possibility. The night air clung to Eleanor's damp hair and the folds of her silk gown as she crept through the shadowed lane beyond Whitby Manor, each cobblestone slick with recent rain and reflecting the faint glow of gas lamps like scattered jewels. The manor receded behind her, its windows flickering with candlelight, a fortress of obligation she had willingly abandoned. Her breath came in hurried wisps, mingling with the mist that rose from the wet streets, each step carrying the thrill of defiance and the chill of uncertainty. She had little plan beyond escape, yet the promise of freedom spurred her forward with a courage she scarcely knew she possessed. Somewhere, she imagined, beyond the fog and the whispers of the town, lay the unknown, and with it, a chance to reclaim her life. The rumble of carriage wheels on stone reached her ears before she saw the vehicle itself, a solitary carriage moving at a measured pace down the lane. Its polished wood gleamed faintly in the lamplight, and the scent of horse sweat and oiled leather marked it as noble transport, yet nothing about it suggested it would become her sanctuary. Eleanor's mind raced, weighing risk against necessity. The chance was fleeting. She slipped forward, pressed against the shadow of a wall, and with a careful glance, seized the open door of the carriage before the driver could notice her presence. The moment was electric, her pulse thundering as she crouched low, the interior dark except for the faint reflection of moonlight on the polished floorboards. The sudden weight of the door closing behind her startled her nearly as much as the sound of a deep, measured voice that came from the seat above. "And who, pray tell, do we have skulking in my carriage at this hour?" The tone was calm yet carried authority, a weight that made Eleanor straighten despite the tremor in her limbs. She looked up to see a man standing in shadow, his coat impeccably tailored, his posture impeccable. The candlelight spilling from a nearby lantern revealed a striking visage, dark eyes keen and assessing, a jaw firm with restraint, yet softened by the faintest hint of amusement. Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Westmere, the very embodiment of measured power and discreet authority, had discovered her. Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat. I meant no harm, sir," she whispered, voice trembling yet resolute. "I merely sought shelter from the night." Her words were a delicate balance between honesty and artifice, a plea for mercy wrapped in the dignity she clung to like a shield. Alexander regarded her with a measured silence, his eyes tracing the line of her shoulders, the mud-splattered hem of her gown, and the determined gleam in her eyes. He did not speak immediately. His silence was deliberate, each heartbeat filling the space with tension. Finally he spoke, low and deliberate. "A bold choice, miss?" "Eleanor Whitby," she supplied, pride and defiance woven into each syllable. He inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement both formal and tinged with intrigue. "Miss Whitby," he repeated as though tasting the name on his tongue, weighing its cadence against the proprieties of society. "You have placed yourself in considerable jeopardy this evening. Tell me, do you often venture uninvited into the carriages of strangers?" There was humor there, faint, yet controlled, as though the amusement might vanish should anyone else witness it. I could not remain at the manor, Eleanor confessed, her voice gaining strength with the admission. I am expected to marry, against my will. To a man whose ambition is to secure my fortune, not my happiness. I could not endure it another night. The words were hurried, desperate yet precise, each syllable revealing a bravery she had scarcely allowed herself to feel before. Alexander's expression softened imperceptibly, the rigid lines of authority yielding to an acknowledgment of her courage. You are fortunate, he said finally, that I am not in the habit of leaving young ladies to wander the rain-soaked lanes alone. It would be most inconvenient for your reputation, and for mine. Eleanor dared a glance at him, seeing in his measured gaze a mixture of irritation, amusement, and curiosity. She recognized the rare quality of discernment, the subtle appreciation of daring that society often overlooked. The carriage rocked gently as it resumed movement, the horse's hooves striking a rhythm against the stones that mirrored Eleanor's racing pulse. The Duke's presence was both imposing and protective. She could feel the quiet authority in his posture, the calm in his measured breathing. Yet beneath it all was an intangible tension, a spark that neither wanted to acknowledge but both sensed. She realized, with a mixture of fear and fascination, that she was not merely hidden in a vehicle. She had intruded into the orbit of a man whose influence extended far beyond the city streets. I must ask, Alexander said after a pause, the faintest note of curiosity threading through his voice, why you fled rather than confided in those nearest you. Surely your family would have restrained your impulses, though perhaps not with such flair. Eleanor's lips quivered in the darkness, her pride resisting, yet she found herself compelled by his understanding. They cannot know my thoughts, she murmured. Society demands a compliance that suffocates. I would rather face the unknown than bow to its chains. A shadow of a smile touched his lips. Indeed, he said softly. A rare and commendable spirit. The words, though simple, sent a rush of warmth through her. In the flickering half-light, amid the creak of leather and the scent of horse and knight, Eleanor sensed the precarious balance of their encounter. A stranger, a duke, and a shared rebellion against the invisible strictures of polite society. They spoke little after that, the conversation giving way to a mutual observation of the road ahead. Rain struck the roof in gentle bursts, the carriage swaying with each puddle and rut. Eleanor's mind raced with possibilities and dangers alike. Her fiancé would surely notice her absence. Society would whisper, speculate, and judge. Yet the immediate threat seemed contained, held at bay by the imposing presence of the Duke. She felt both sheltered and exposed in his quiet vigilance, a paradox that stirred feelings she did not yet dare name. The carriage eventually slowed as the lights of the city gave way to open countryside, darkened fields stretching like velvet under the pale moon. Alexander's voice, quiet yet commanding, finally broke the silence. You are far from home, he observed, and yet remarkably composed. Eleanor drew a shivering breath, aware of the chill but also of the sudden intimacy of their shared predicament. She had fled the manor, seeking freedom, yet found herself bound in this fleeting moment, to a man whose power and authority dwarfed her own. I must thank you, sir, she said softly, a tremor of gratitude threading through her words, for not abandoning me. Consider it less charity than circumstance, he replied, his eyes dark pools reflecting moonlight and concern. Yet I shall ensure that no harm befalls you this night, Miss Whitby. That much at least I promise. Eleanor inclined her head in acknowledgement, the gesture humble yet proud, and in that quiet exchange, an unspoken trust began to form, a fragile, electrifying bond born of necessity, courage, and the first hints of mutual fascination. As the carriage pressed onward into the darkness, Eleanor allowed herself a single fleeting thought, that the night might yet hold wonders unimagined, dangers unforeseen, and perhaps a destiny entirely her own. Somewhere between the rain-soaked lanes and the whisper of trees brushing past, a story had begun, one that would challenge society, test courage, and awaken the heart in ways neither she nor Alexander could yet comprehend. And with that thought, she leaned back against the carriage wall, the rhythm of the horses echoing the beat of her own heart, and allowed the journey to carry her forward into uncertainty, intrigue, and the slow, inevitable unfolding of something far greater than mere escape. The carriage came to a slow halt beside a manor whose silhouette rose from the misted countryside like a dark promise. The windows glimmered faintly with firelight, and the distant hum of night insects mingled with the low thrum of hooves on gravel. Eleanor stepped down carefully, her skirts damp, her hair curling against her neck from the rain, and took in the grandeur of the estate. It was a residence both formidable and welcoming, the kind of place where power and comfort coexisted quietly, without ostentation. Alexander Hawthorne, the Duke of Westmere, led the way, his movements precise, yet relaxed, as though he had walked these halls countless times, though Eleanor suspected that few had ever ventured beyond the polished public rooms. The interior of the manor exuded warmth, firelight casting dancing shadows across tapestries embroidered with the ducal crest. The air smelled faintly of burning oak, wax and polished wood, mingling with the subtler scent of old books and faint lavender from the servants' discreet tidying. Eleanor could feel the weight of centuries in the walls, a sense of history that mirrored the burden of expectation she herself carried. Alexander gestured toward a high-backed chair beside the hearth. "Sit," he said softly, voice steady, controlled, yet carrying an undercurrent of invitation. She obeyed, placing her damp hands delicately on her lap, aware of the crackle of the fire reflecting the tension that lingered between them. "Miss Whitby," he began, folding his hands neatly over his knees, "I am aware that circumstances force you into decisions few would have the courage to make. Yet I must ask, why risk so much? To flee is one matter, to enter a stranger's carriage is quite another." His gaze was steady, not accusatory, but filled with a keen perception that made Eleanor feel as if he could read every thought she had sought to conceal. She met his eyes, the flicker of firelight tracing shadows that softened his features, revealing a vulnerability beneath the mask of authority. "I had no choice," she whispered, her voice low, edged with both defiance and fragility. "I could not remain at the manor where every step, every breath, was weighed and judged. My family, they cannot understand the cost of compliance. My dignity, my very self, is at stake. To marry without desire, without consent, it is a life I cannot accept." The words, though measured, trembled slightly, revealing the fear that underpinned her courage. Alexander listened in silence, his expression inscrutable, yet Eleanor sensed the faintest shift, a trace of empathy, of recognition. He rose then, moving toward a small desk near the window, and produced a folded sheet of parchment. "I thought it prudent to offer you something," he said, placing it gently upon the table. "A record of my identity, my intentions, and a measure of assurance that you will find no harm under my roof tonight." Eleanor bent forward, examining the paper carefully. The elegant handwriting, the precise seal of the Westmere crest, confirmed what she had yet to comprehend fully. She was in the presence of one of the most powerful men in England. For the first time, the gravity of her situation pressed upon her not as a threat alone, but as an opportunity entwined with danger. Alexander moved back toward the hearth, his gaze settling on her with a quiet intensity that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. "You are aware," he said, his voice softer now, almost confiding, "that those who vanish from society's expectations rarely do so without consequence. Yet I perceive a spirit that refuses to be contained. It is rare, Miss Whitby, and it merits respect." Eleanor felt a warmth rise in her chest at the acknowledgement, a subtle validation that made her feel seen in a way few ever had. She dared a small smile, hesitant, yet sincere, a bridge across the gulf of rank, duty and propriety that separated them. The fire crackled between them, a quiet witness to a conversation that neither entirely understood nor wished to rush. Eleanor found herself speaking more freely, words flowing in a torrent that surprised even her. "I have spent my life learning the careful art of obedience, of silence, of measured compliance. Yet tonight I realize that all the lessons, all the proprieties, cannot contain the truth of who I am. I will not be a vessel for ambition, nor a shadow in another's designs. I must choose for myself even if the choice invites scandal, even if it brings fear." Alexander regarded her in silence for a long moment, then approached, placing a chair opposite hers. He seated himself with deliberate care, close enough to feel the warmth of the fire upon both of them, yet mindful of the restraint that decorum demanded. "Your words carry weight beyond mere declaration," he said. "Few possess the courage to articulate such truth in the face of society's machinery. And yet," he paused, eyes dark with thought, "to speak is not always to be heard. Your independence, it is admirable yet perilous." Eleanor's gaze held his, steady, unwavering. "I am aware," she replied. "And I accept the peril, for it is preferable to a life of silent compromise." There was a brief silence, filled only by the soft crackle of fire and the occasional sigh of the wind against the windows. Then Alexander leaned forward slightly, his voice low and careful. "You have evoked in me a measure of curiosity and admiration I seldom grant. It is not common to encounter one who defies expectation with such grace and intellect. Your courage, though born of desperation, reveals a depth of character I cannot ignore. Eleanor's heart quickened at the words, a mixture of pride, surprise, and the faint stirrings of something tender she did not yet dare to name. Thank you, she murmured, her voice scarcely above the whisper of the fire. It is unusual to be understood so readily by one I have just met. Alexander allowed a faint smile, one that softened the formality of his countenance. Perhaps it is less a matter of understanding than recognition, he said, tone low, as though sharing a secret meant only for them. Eleanor felt a thrill pass through her at the intimacy of the remark, and for a moment, the weight of rank, expectation, and duty seemed to fall away. In its place lingered a fragile, electrifying connection, an acknowledgement that beneath the trappings of power and propriety, two individuals might find truth in each other's presence. Minutes passed, yet felt timeless, as conversation gave way to quiet contemplation. Eleanor's gaze wandered to the window, where the rain had ceased and the countryside lay dark, vast, and mysterious. She felt the full measure of her escape, not merely from the manor or an unwanted marriage, but from a life dictated entirely by others. Here, in this firelit room with the Duke, she found the first flicker of freedom paired with trust, an unspoken promise that perhaps courage, virtue, and desire could coexist. Alexander rose then, breaking the fragile spell, and approached the window. He looked out at the moon-drenched fields, contemplative. "Tonight is only the beginning," he said softly, almost to himself. "The consequences of your flight, Miss Whitby, will ripple beyond these walls. And yet," he turned to her, eyes gleaming with the faintest amusement, "I suspect neither of you will find this evening easily forgotten." Eleanor met his gaze, heart quickening at the blend of warning and invitation. She knew, with sudden clarity, that the path ahead would be perilous, demanding, and exhilarating. And that, perhaps, in Alexander Hawthorne, she had encountered a force as formidable and compelling as her own will. The fire's glow danced across their faces, illuminating courage, curiosity, and the tender stirrings of trust and admiration. Outside, the night held secrets, promises, and dangers yet unseen. Inside, two souls, newly intertwined by circumstance and choice, began the delicate dance of recognition, respect, and the slow, inevitable unfolding of something far greater than either had anticipated. The first light of dawn crept across the sprawling Westmere estate, pale fingers brushing the misted gardens and glimmering on dew-laden roses. Eleanor Whitby stood at the edge of the terrace, her skirts brushing the frost-kissed stones, breath visible in the chill morning air. Her heart thrummed with anticipation, a mixture of fear, hope, and unspoken longing. Last night's confessions, whispered words by firelight, and the delicate intimacy shared with Alexander Hawthorne had left her restless, poised between the weight of the past and the promise of a future she dared not yet fully name. The manor behind her was quiet, servants stirring softly, unaware that within its walls two lives had begun to intertwine in ways society would scarcely approve. Alexander approached, his dark coat brushing faintly against the frozen gravel, hands clasped behind his back, eyes steady yet softened by the night's revelations. The Duke's presence was commanding, yet there was a tenderness in his measured gaze that Eleanor had not expected, a quiet acknowledgement of her courage and the burdens she bore. "The morning is cold," he remarked, voice low, carrying the faintest edge of amusement, "yet I find it suits reflection better than the heat of the ballroom." Eleanor's lips curved into a small, wry smile. "Reflection is welcome, though I confess my thoughts are rarely calm at such an hour." He drew closer, the frost crunching under his boots, and regarded her with a candor reserved for the rare few who had glimpsed his solitude. "You have chosen a perilous path," he said softly. "Your absence from Whitby Manor will not go unnoticed, and the ramifications, though subtle at first, may ripple far beyond your imagination. Yet," his voice strengthened, carrying the faintest tremor of admiration, "I do not doubt your courage. And I do not intend to let circumstance alone dictate the consequences of your bravery." Eleanor's breath caught at the words, a mixture of reassurance and the electrifying hint of something more profound. "I have feared, Duke Hawthorne," she admitted, eyes fixed on the garden below, "that in fleeing, I have not only endangered myself but those I love, and perhaps invited scandal I cannot yet comprehend. I wished only to claim a measure of freedom, and yet—" her voice faltered, caught between the weight of expectation and the sudden intimacy of confession. Alexander extended a gloved hand, not as a gesture of command, but as an invitation. "And yet," he said, "you have awakened a truth few dare acknowledge. That freedom and integrity are rarely granted, but must be seized by those bold enough to claim them. Eleanor, your courage is remarkable." Her eyes lifted to meet his, the early light catching the intensity there. For a moment, words failed her, replaced by the quiet language of recognition. The tilt of his head, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the slow, deliberate exhalation that spoke volumes more than any declaration could. The Duke's presence, his authority, his undeniable charm, was a force she could neither resist nor fully comprehend, yet she sensed that in this space, at this fragile juncture, a choice could be made that would alter the course of both their lives. Alexander's voice broke the silence, gentle yet insistent. You need not face society's machinations alone. If you choose, I shall protect your honor, shield you from those who would exploit your courage and stand beside you, not as guardian alone, but as one who respects the spirit and mind that compel you to defy expectation. Eleanor's pulse quickened, a mixture of relief and unspoken desire coursing through her. She stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing with every heartbeat, yet tempered by the propriety ingrained in both of them. I do not know how to repay such generosity, she murmured, voice soft, tinged with both gratitude and the faintest edge of vulnerability. Alexander's gaze softened further, and he inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging that no repayment was required, only trust. Repayment is unnecessary, he said. What matters is your choice, freely made, uncoerced, and without fear of obligation. Choose for yourself, Eleanor, as boldly as you fled the manor last night. The wind stirred, brushing against her cheek, carrying the scent of frost, roses, and distant woodland. Eleanor drew a deep breath, steadying herself against the surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm both reason and decorum. I choose, she said finally, voice clear, carrying the weight of determination and longing, to follow my own path. To live with integrity, courage, and, perhaps, if fortune permits, alongside one who sees the truth of my spirit. She paused, the words hanging in the crisp morning air, then added softly, if such a path exists. Alexander stepped forward, bridging the remaining space, and lowered his voice, carrying it so only she could hear. It does, he said, a faint, genuine smile curving his lips. It exists because you are willing to claim it. And because I shall not let fear, convention, or fortune alone dictate the lives we might forge together. Eleanor's chest rose and fell with a mixture of relief and elation, and for the first time since the events that had driven her into flight, she felt the possibility of a life measured not by duty alone, but by choice, courage, and shared respect. They remained there, silent, the world beyond the terrace quiet, save for the distant stirrings of the estate coming to life. In that silence lay a delicate understanding, a fragile yet undeniable bond that neither dared name aloud fully, yet both recognized. It was a communion of trust, courage, and the first hints of a tender, burgeoning affection, an acknowledgement that beneath the weight of societal expectation, a space existed where two souls might meet unencumbered by rank, obligation, or scandal. A distant carriage bell echoed faintly across the grounds, and Alexander's gaze sharpened momentarily, awareness of the practical world intruding upon the intimacy of the morning. Yet he did not falter. Instead, he turned fully to Eleanor, eyes steady and warm. Let us face the world then, he said. Together as allies, as equals, and, if fortune allows, perhaps as companions in that rarest of adventures, life shared willingly in both freedom and trust. Eleanor nodded, the words resonating deeply within her. She felt a mixture of exhilaration and solemnity, the understanding that their choices carried consequences, yet also the certainty that for the first time she was shaping her destiny. The frost beneath their feet seemed less a barrier than a threshold, a liminal space between fear and courage, expectation and liberation. As the sun broke fully over the horizon, spilling golden light across the terrace and glinting upon the frost, Eleanor and Alexander remained side by side. Neither spoke, yet in their silence lay the weight of promise, the recognition of shared understanding, and the quiet stirrings of love tempered by respect, courage, and history itself. The events of the previous night, the flight from the manor, and the confessions by firelight had led to this moment, delicate, potent, and infinitely significant. And as the morning air warmed, as the estate awakened in distant echoes of life and duty, Eleanor Whitby allowed herself a rare, unguarded smile. She was no longer a captive of expectation, nor merely a shadow in the designs of others. She had chosen, boldly and deliberately, to embrace courage, autonomy, and the uncertain promise of love. Beside her, Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Westmere, acknowledged silently the same truth, that power, respect, and influence were rendered all the richer when tempered by trust, admiration, and the shared commitment of two kindred spirits. Together they faced the new day, the possibilities it promised, and the intricate dance of society and passion that awaited them. And though the world would whisper, judge, and observe, they had chosen each other, and in that choice lay a freedom, a dignity, and a nascent love that no scandal could diminish, no expectation could restrain. Their story, begun in desperation and secrecy, would continue in courage, honor, and the quiet unfolding of hearts attuned to both desire and duty.